Hello, welcome to Rights of Women. I'm here in London with Lina Meruane, author of Seeing Red, which is getting amazing reviews all over the place, which is fantastic. It's also almost the end of Women in Translation Month, so I thought it'd be really nice to speak to a writer who's been translated into English as well. Hello, Lina.
Hi.
So I wanted to start really sort of basic question about where the idea for the novel came from.
Okay, so Seeing Red is a novel that in the very beginning was meant to be a memoir.
Okay.
So I had always written fiction, and suddenly I thought, well, I have this sort of event that happened. Going blind is not a typical event that people go through, and I had done a lot of thinking after that happened, and learned a lot of stuff that deal with vision and eyes and blindness. And so I had really thought that I might perhaps step out of fiction and write a memoir. And I had in my mind two memoirs that had really struck me as a young reader. One was The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, which is about, of course, depression, but it's a lovely novel too. Right? It's a very literary memoir. And then there was William Styron's, I will not remember the title now, but anyway, it's his memoir on depression.
Yeah.
It's a very short book, but its intensity is incredible, right? And I remember actually reading that book and not being, I lived alone at the time, and not being able to finish it because I was just feeling sick while reading it. And I thought, well, this is the kind of memoir that I would like to write, right? Not the sort of more flat autobiographical kind of writing, but something that actually would sort of carry that intensity. Yeah. So that's what I started out doing. But on page 5, I realized that actually the book was turning into a novel. Because a lot of time had passed since that event, and the event itself didn't seem so interesting to me any longer, and it was more about the new questions that I had and how the sort of characters were developing characteristics of their own and sort of getting further and further away of the actual people that I was basing those characters on.
Right.
So that's how that started. So I always say that it's a book that starts with an autobiographical event and then moves into fiction.
Right.
And I also figured out that it was actually interesting to start with something very biographical in a language that seems very close to the author, because I somehow need the reader to believe that everything is true,
right,
so that the effect as you go along is sort of more powerful. I don't want to spoil the book, but
yeah.
I'll just say that.
Okay, that's really interesting, because the second thing I wanted to ask about was this idea that women always write autobiography because we've got no imaginations and don't have anything else to write about. Yeah. So how did it feel to name the character after yourself and to have that start with that autobiographical event? So
when I realized that it was actually not a memoir anymore, but it was a novel, I shifted the name from Lina, which is my name, to Lucina, which actually in Spanish at least sort of evokes the idea of light. Luz, Lucina, right? Light. Yeah. So I did that, and when I got to the end of the novel, I felt, well, but there's something in me here too. And so let me bring in the name, my name, but not as the character's name, but as the character's pen name. So it would sort of create some sort of tension between the identity of the character and the identity of the writer, and sort of also underline the fact that this is a persona, right? It's the book's persona. So there's a lot of sort of making up in this book, which actually does make it a novel. So, and I did struggle, right? I know, I am very aware that women are supposed to only write diaries and confessional poetry and autobiography, and that's sort of looked down upon. But then I thought, well, but why is it looked down upon? Men also do write about their own lives, but nobody seems to ask them how much of a biography or personal stuff is in that book. So I thought, well, to hell with it, right? I'm just going to write what I need to write, because there's a lot of thinking and a lot of imagination that has gone into this book. But I think that we also need to be aware that writers do include autobiographical materials in their writing always, right? And when I say autobiographical material, events that happened, thoughts, feelings, sort of projections, and also the reading that we do is also part of our biography, and the friends we have and the conversations we listen to are part of our lives. So it's sort of unavoidable. But I do think that women are actually quite imaginative, starting with Virginia Woolf, right? Who I mean, starting with, just to put a dot somewhere, right? Sort of imaginative fiction coming from women has always been part of that tradition too.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I wanted to talk about the relationships that you explore in the book, because you prod out both the romantic relationship and family relationships. Brothers a little bit more so with the parents. What is it that interests you about those types of relationships?
Well, I think I've always been sort of really interested in sort of how the family relationships work. I think that there is so much to say about family relationships. There's all the love and all the hate that you can find it sort of in that particular space. And because it's also a novel about dependency, right? Losing sight immediately puts the character in a dependent mode. And so sort of I wanted to really explore that sense of dependency and also what it entails for her to become independent, right? And so so for example, the mother-daughter relationship is very tense in the book. And the mother is so loving and so caring that she wants to take over, but that actually makes her daughter an invalid. And then there's this really sort of powerful, I think, scene where the protagonist is very angry that her mother has sort of undone her suitcase and done it again to help her out. But then she says, "Mom, you're not allowing me to learn to be a blind person," right? So I think that there is always sort of the question of love and how impairing love might be. But then on the other hand, the other question that really interests me in this book is sort of to what extent can you bring the question of unconditional love, right? Because we always tend to romanticize that promise of unconditional love coming from parents or romantic partners. But if you actually think about that promise, if you take it to a real literal extreme, it can be quite a problematic promise. Give me everything you have for love. It's actually a question that women have been subjected to, sort of the self-sacrifice for love, right? So what happens when you turn that question around, and when Lucina asks her boyfriend, sort of, what will you give me for love, right? And I think those questions were the questions that really took over the book as I wrote. Yeah.
And without any spoilers, ends quite dramatically, and
yes,
it's very exciting. Yes. I want to talk about the ending. I know we can't, but it's such a brilliant end.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I know a lot of writers who say like, so what the hell with the end? It shouldn't mean something, but I do think that the novel is really sort of built towards where it's going, right? So sort of it's a novel about the transformation of a character who is blinded and dependent and struggling, and how she really turns this around. So the inversion of sort of the power relation is very important in the book, and so this is why we're not going to spoil it.
Yes. So there's two things I want to talk about that follow on from what you just said, actually. So let's talk about the protagonist first, because she gets more and more frustrated as the novel goes on, and I'm sure you're aware that the last few years, really, there's been lots of conversation about unlikable women in novels.
Oh no, I was not aware.
I think a lot of it came when Claire Masood published The Woman Upstairs, and you know, there's been a fair few articles and comments since then. So I wonder whether you thought about that at the time, whether it's something that's come up since, what you think about the unlikable, in quotes, because I hate that idea, woman in fiction.
It sounds a very anti-feminist thing to do, right? A very incorrect politically to sort of talk about sort of unlikable women. I think there's, two things that we can think about. And it is that, when we have powerful women, we tend to not like them. We tend to sort of accuse them of being too self-centered, too egotistic, too powerful, too bossy, too pushy, right? And we use all these words mostly for women, right? So women empowered or women empowered tend to be unliked, but this is perhaps a cultural question, right? A question of how we relate to women that take on really powerful positions, right? That's one thing to be said. The other thing is that I myself have always explored sort of the tension between women, right? I mean, we know or at least I feel I know a lot about, culturally, right, about sort of the tense and difficult relationships between women and men, right? And but I'm not sure we have explored sort of the tense relationships between women, or the inversion of the relation when a woman is actually overpowering a man, right? We tend to not see that. I tend to think back to Virginia Woolf, who explains in Rooms of One's Own, right, how she finds that it's very hard to find books, one, written by women at the time, this is the 1920s in England, and also how when you find women, there's always a man in the middle of those women, always competing for a man. So I have sort of distanced myself from that representation, but not the fact that there is tension between women. And it's also part of a sort of misogynistic scheme, right? So I think, I mean, why not, right? Why would we only speak about likable women who are also not putting any kind of tension in the social paradigm, right? So I think there's a lot to say about women who are criminals, right? Women who have shot their husbands instead of the other way around, right? And sort of explore those tensions. I find it actually an interesting thing. And I know that it does have sort of problematic effects on sort of the discussion of feminism. But I don't think literature should be politically correct. I think literature is actually meant to ask the difficult questions.
Great. And the other thing I wanted to ask about was the structure of the book, because we talked a bit about how the tension builds, and I wondered whether you'd planned that from the start so that you knew what the trajectory was going to be, or it was something that happened as you were writing.
Okay, so I am not the kind of writer who designs the novel sort of before writing. So there is only sort of an idea of where the book starts. And I actually wrote this book while I had to finish my PhD. And somebody asked me to write a short piece on disease because my previous novel also deals with this issue, and there was this anthology that was coming out and they wanted a new piece. So I started writing this book, which was actually going to be a short story. But once I started, I realized that it was actually going to be a novel, that there was too many more things that I wanted to say. And so I wrote the first 30 pages, then I left it, finished my dissertation, PhD, before I was kicked out of the university, and came back to the book and realized for my own horror that I had started the book with what seemed at the time the most intense moment of the narrative. And the sort of the challenge was going to be how to have this book not sort of dissolve and sort of lose tension and become nothing. And so I kind of struggled with that. I thought, so what am I going to do now? Because it really felt that it had to start that way. Fortunately for me, and because I did not have much time for writing at the time, I had written in short fragments, maybe 2 pages. And so what I realized is that if I could keep the novel going in short episodes, which each felt like a sort of flash fiction moment with its own power in it, with its own sort of problem to solve in it, then maybe the novel would sort of stand until the end. So I kept on sort of working on these shorter fragments with a little subtitle, looking for the moment of intensity in that episode. And halfway through, I thought, well, I could also continue forever doing this, and I didn't think that that was sort of a good thing. And so I started really thinking hard, so where is this going to end? How is this going to end? And I figured out halfway, as I said, that this was going to become some sort of horror novel. That it started with a sort of more testimonial flavor, and it was going to change genre and go into sort of a horror novel.
Great. And I wanted to ask about translation, so I've got a couple of things to ask about that. The first was about how you work with your translators. Are you hands-on? Do you get involved? And particularly with the English translation, which Meg McDowell has done. Obviously, you speak English, so I wonder whether you have more to do with it. Have you read it?
Yes. Okay. So the reality is that I would rather not look into translation. True that I do speak in English and I teach in English and I am a good reader of English, but my literary English is not that good. So in the past, when I have collaborated with translators on short stories, this was many years ago, I would find that I wanted to fix English my way.
Right.
Because I am actually somebody who's very interested in how the language and the rhythm in language works. And rhythm in Spanish does not translate well into rhythm in English.
Yeah.
It's worked out a different way because of the way that intonation and the way in which words are accentuated.
Oh, right, okay.
Right, in the way that rhythm, sort of the music of the language is actually worked out in a very different way.
Yeah.
So I would find that I was actually interfering with the translator. Or for example, I hate words with hyphen.
Right.
Right, but then sometimes there's just that word and things like that, right? So I realized that if I messed with Megan's translation, I would probably force her to do things that she wouldn't do.
Yeah.
And the novel is already challenging because there's sentences that are sort of shut and cut halfway where they shouldn't in regular Spanish.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of something that I had to decide not to mess with. And actually I did trust Megan as a very good translator. So what I actually ended up doing was only answering Megan's questions,
Right.
which were more than a few, and then also answering or collaborating in the discussion between Megan and the copy editor, who was very worried about my punctuation. And so there were 400 sort of comments and questions.
Right.
Many of them had actually to do with punctuation, but then also the copy editor, who was very, very good, and she found some things that didn't make much sense. And when I went back to it, I figured out that Megan had made some little mistake halfway through, and then that turned into something that didn't make sense.
Right, okay.
Very few. I mean, Megan is a really sophisticated translator, has really excellent literary skills, right? So I got into that, and then I used that conversation and that Q&A, and I sent it to all my other translators.
Right.
I also had a previous translation into Italian, and I also used that Q&A. So I've been sharing my Q&A with translators because there's a lot of, one of the other things about the novel is that there is the coming together of Chilean Spanish and Galician Spanish and Peruvian Spanish and English. So that is actually very challenging. How do you translate different forms of Spanish or different dialects of Spanish, so to speak, right, into English? The French actually did something very interesting. They kept the English pieces of the book in Spanish,
Right.
in the French version, but they also kept the words in Spanish that Megan McDowell kept in the English version.
Right, okay.
So they have the French with bits and pieces of the Spanish that Megan kept, and also bits and pieces of the English that I had produced in the first version.
Yeah.
So I thought that that was very interesting because there is actually a very intense sort of cosmopolitan coming together of different languages and sort of slang of each language.
Yeah. Oh, it's really interesting because I don't speak any other languages. I've got a tiny bit of stuff that I did at high school. So it's always interesting when I'm talking about the sort of rhythm of the sentences, because the things that you talked about, the way you wrote it, I think are in Megan's translation, but are maybe not in the same place as where you put them. Do you know what I mean? Because there's lots about the language, the cutting off of sentences, the rhythm that I picked up on. But yeah, it's interesting that they might not be in the same place.
Yeah, and also interestingly, I think that what would have happened if I had actually read the whole translation and tried to figure it out is that I would have wanted to change everything. I mean, it's also hard not to do that in Spanish now. I try not to go back to my books because I would fix everything. But I think that a lot of the things I'm writing in Spanish really have to do with the word that comes in. There's a lot of sort of free association in my writing. So once a word comes in, I start playing with that word. I can't do that in English. And if I had, I would have rewritten the whole book just to make it function with the new words that were coming up. So impossible.
Yeah, because you might as well have done it yourself.
I might as well spend that time writing my next book.
Yeah, sure. Fantastic. And we talked about, actually, before we started filming, it's a bit cheeky to talk about what we were saying before we started filming, but it's Women in Translation Month, which I've already mentioned.
Yes.
And the idea of it is to highlight the disparity between the number of male and female writers translated into English. So I wondered what you thought about the disparity, whether it's something that concerns you.
The sense right now is that more women are being translated, more young women, and we are finding that. I mean, I'm sort of amazed at the amount of women that my contemporaries who are getting their books translated, and that's making me very happy. But when you actually go to the numbers, when you actually go to the statistics, that's sort of the hard facts, what you see is actually that many less women are being translated. It's also true that women have a harder time publishing their books in the first place, and they have a harder time being placed sort of in visible areas of bookstores for longer periods. So I think there's sort of a lot of things to sort of add up here. And I am currently in the jury of an international contest, a Latin American contest. I don't want to sort of say anything more about that because it's, for now, sort of nobody knows. Right? But what I found is that I got sent 12 novels after the sort of the first round of readers. And from those, there's only 2 women. So I thought, wow, that's really like worse than the normal percentage. So I went down to the back to the list to see how many women had submitted books. It actually was a little bit more than that percentage, but not much more. And I thought, why is it that women are sending their books less, or is it that the editors themselves are choosing among their books, thinking who might get the prize, right? And so there's all these little things that get tied into the fact that less women actually get translated or get prized for their books. So I think there's still a conversation to be had. I would also like to add that this is something that I have sort of thought about for a long time, and I've actually sort of discussed with my writing, creative writing students. And when we think about the writers that we like, when we as women or men get interviewed and are asked to suggest books and recommend books, how many women are there? And it's really interesting to find that it's mostly men recommending male authors. I don't think they do this intentionally. It's that probably they haven't read the women. Or suddenly they forget the women. And now that they're more conscientious of this, they tend to mention one woman who is usually a foreign woman from the tradition that the writer is speaking of, and she's probably dead or very, very old. So there's sort of like almost a sense that they're not competing with this very well-known figure. So you always get Virginia Woolf to come back to Woolf, right? But it's very hard to get them to, you know, recommend contemporary women writers from their own countries or continents.
And I don't know if you saw the outrage at the weekend about the New York Times. There was a New York Times writer who had written a list of books for the summer, and I think it was something like 10 men and 1 woman, and he was asking for recommendations of women he should read. You work for New York Times, there must be loads in your office, have a look.
And the New York Times reviews lots of books by women, but the thing is that men tend to choose books written by men, and men are listened to, and so it's really interesting. I mean, and this gets repeated. I mean, when you looked at also, it was one of the most important reviewers' books at the New York Times, not the supplement necessarily, and her 10 top were, you know, 8 were men, 2 were women. So that proportion, 20%, is strikingly present.
And I wanted to ask about, I suppose this fits with that idea, but you've been described as one of Chile's best contemporary novelists. How does that feel? What does it mean
That's
to you?
a very strange thing to be, I mean, I don't know, I can't really, I think that I have many contemporaries who are really excellent writers, and I think what happens is that I am in the United States, and now my books are being translated, so my books are being read right now, but I think there's plenty of contemporaries that deserve that same recognition, right?
Yeah.
So.
So it leads me on to the last question, because my blog's all about recommending women writers, and I always ask everyone I interview to recommend a book they've read recently that they think we should read. So who have you been reading? What should we catch up with?
What should we catch up with? Okay, so the last book that I really loved, and I'm a little behind with my own reading because I'm reading from my novel, and I'm sort of, my character is now a physicist, so I'm just reading a lot of, because, you know, black holes and that kind of stuff. But the book that I recently read, and I know this will come as no surprise, is Deborah Levy's Hot Milk. I really enjoyed that book, not only because the way it's written, which is this beautiful, very poetic language, and also very vivid and fresh imagery, but also because she does explore something that I'm personally interested in, and it's this mother-daughter relationship. I don't know if you know the story, but just to tell for people who haven't read the novel, it's the mother and daughter travel to the south of Spain to visit a doctor because the mother can't walk. And sometimes she can, but sometimes she can't, and they haven't been able to figure out what's wrong with her. And you more and more sense what the problem is, right? The mother is some sort of hypochondriac, but she's also very manipulative. So it's really a story about the protagonist, Sophie, liberating herself from sort of the power the mother exerts on her. And it really does explore sort of her sexuality, Sophie's, and her relation with her mother, and the relation with this doctor, which is sort of some sort of shaman, but also a very sort of bright psychologist, so to speak. So it's a really wonderful novel. I did enjoy it very much, and now, of course, I bought all of the rest of Levy's books to read. I'm currently reading her essay, which is a response to Orwell.
I haven't read that one yet.
I mean, well, I'm just through the first chapter, and it's quite interesting.
And I think actually Hot Milk's an interesting one to read alongside your novel. I think there's some similarities.
I found, this is something that really resonated with me, because I think that this is something that also is very present in my own novel. I mean, the unlikable women. Here we go. Right?
Fantastic. Right, if you're watching this on YouTube, there are links below to my review of the book, and also links to buy the book, which obviously I'd recommend because it's fantastic. If you're on the blog, links below to buy as well. Also links to my review of Deborah Levy's book, because I read that last year, I think it was. But it was fantastic. Loved it. So again, if you've not read that, everything's there. Just time to say thank you, Lina.
Thank you so much. Thank you.